Montana Territory, November 1883. Elevation, 5,200 feet above sea level. There's a ridge in the Bitterroot Range where the wind doesn't just blow, it hunts. It comes down from the north in long, low sweeps, finds the gaps between the logs, and presses cold air through walls like water through a cracked dam. The settlers who arrived in that valley in the late 1870s knew this. They had been warned. Most of them built their cabins wide and short, stacked their firewood high, and prayed that January would be merciful. Most of them were wrong, but there was one cabin on that ridge that stood apart. Not because it looked different. From the outside, it looked like every other 16 by 20-foot homestead in the valley. Notch pine logs, a stone chimney, a single south-facing window, and a low-pitched roof packed with sod and spruce boughs. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing that would make a passing trapper stop his horse and stare. What made it different, you couldn't see from the trail. You had to go inside. You had to notice the trapdoor near the back wall, partially hidden beneath a woven rug. You had to lift it, hold a candle over the edge, and look down into the earth. And what you found there wasn't a root cellar, wasn't a storage pit, and wasn't a well. It was a bedroom, dug 6 feet into the ground, lined with flat sandstone and packed clay. Warm enough on the coldest nights that the family's youngest children slept there without a single blanket over their chests. No one in that valley had seen anything like it. A few people laughed. One man called a folly. The woman who built it, her name was Edna Calloway, said nothing. She just kept feeding her family and waiting for winter to prove her right. This is the story of what she built, why it worked, and how one brutal storm turned a quiet woman's strange idea into the most copied design in that entire mountain district. If you've never heard of earth-sheltered sleeping chambers in frontier homesteads, subscribe right now. Every week we uncover a real technique that worked when lives depended on it. Hit the like button, drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and stay with us, because what Edna understood about the ground beneath her feet was decades ahead of her time. Edna Calloway was not an engineer. She was not a stonemason. She was a 34-year-old woman from western Pennsylvania who had followed her husband, Roy Calloway, to Montana Territory in the spring of 1879, carrying 2 children, a cast-iron skillet, and a fundamental distrust of problems she couldn't solve herself. Roy was a capable man, good with an axe, good with horses, reliable in the way that frontier men had to be, or they simply didn't last. He built their first cabin in the fall of that same year. Square, solid, sealed with chinking moss and dried mud. By every standard of the valley, it was a decent structure. Their neighbors said so. The man who ran the trading post at the south end of the valley, a former carpenter named Gus Prentice, walked the perimeter and nodded with approval. But Edna knew something Gus Prentice couldn't feel from outside the walls. The cabin was cold at the floor. Not everywhere, not always, but in the deep months from late December through February, the cold came up from the ground with a patience that the fire in the hearth simply couldn't match. The stone foundation radiated frost. The pine plank flooring, laid directly over a thin layer of gravel, conducted the chill upward as efficiently as a block of ice. And the children slept on the floor. Their youngest, a girl named Clara, was 4 years old in the winter of 1881. She developed a persistent cough that December that lasted until March. The following winter, she developed again. Edna sat by that child's bed for 6 nights straight, feeding the fire every 2 hours, watching the frost on the interior log walls melt and refreeze with the rhythm of the flames. She kept the room at what she estimated to be around 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 degrees Celsius near the ceiling. But at floor level, the temperature dropped to something closer to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to feel. Cold enough to matter. That was the problem nobody else was solving. Not the air temperature, but the ground temperature. The settlers of that valley were fighting the cold at the wrong altitude. They were heating the air above their heads while their children slept in a frost pocket 6 inches above frozen earth. Edna had noticed something the previous autumn while digging an extension to their root cellar. 3 feet down, the ground was cool but not cold. 4 feet down, it was almost stable. At 5.5 feet, even in late October, The Earth held a temperature she estimated at around 48 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 to 10 degrees Celsius. Consistent, unaffected by the wind, unaffected by the night air. She didn't need to heat that space much. She just needed to sleep in it. She told Roy about the idea on a Sunday evening in early March of 1882, while the last of that winter's ice was still thick on the window glass. He listened carefully. He didn't laugh. He said, "That's a lot of work, Edna." She said, "So is watching Clara cough all winter." He didn't argue after that. The digging began in late April of 1882, once the ground had softened enough to break with a pick. Roy handled most of the excavation. Edna directed it. The chamber she designed measured roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, about 3 by 3.6 meters, with a ceiling height of 6 feet 4 inches, 193 centimeters, tall enough to stand in, important for air circulation and for keeping the space from feeling like a tomb. The floor sat 5 feet 10 inches, 178 centimeters, below the cabin's finished floor level. The trapdoor entrance was framed with oak timber salvaged from a broken wagon bed and positioned near the back wall of the cabin, where the main hearth's foundation stones ran deepest into the ground. That positioning was not accidental. Edna had observed, correctly, that the hearthstone foundation acted as a slow-release heat battery. The sandstone blocks that formed the base of the chimney absorbed heat from every fire and released it gradually over hours, sometimes days. By locating the underground chamber directly adjacent to that foundation, she ensured that one full wall of the sleeping room, the north-facing stone wall, was in direct thermal contact with the hearth's mass. Local accounts describe this wall as always warm to the touch, even when the fire had been out since midnight. The remaining 3 walls were lined with flat-stacked limestone gathered from the creek bed below the ridge. Limestone is a dense, stable material with good thermal mass. It absorbs ambient warmth slowly and releases it slowly, smoothing out the temperature swings that made the upper cabin so difficult to heat. The floor was packed clay, tamped firm, covered with a layer of clean sand, and then pine plank boards laid over a grid of small round river stones. An air gap of roughly 2 inches, 5 centimeters, that prevented the floor planks from conducting ground cold directly into bare feet. Ventilation was addressed with 2 narrow channels, each about 4 inches, 10 centimeters, in diameter, bored diagonally upward through the earth and exiting through the cabin's back wall, just above grade level. These were fitted with hand-carved wooden plugs that could be opened or closed depending on conditions. In mild weather, both were left slightly open to allow passive air exchange. In the hardest cold, both were plugged completely, allowing the thermal mass of the walls and the hearth foundation to maintain the chamber's temperature with no active fire required inside the room itself. There was a single oil lamp mounted on an iron bracket. There were 2 built-in sleeping platforms, wide enough for a child on each side or one adult, framed in pine and covered with dry grass mats topped with deer hide. The ceiling was the underside of the cabin's original floor joists, which Edna packed with 6 inches of dried moss and clay for additional insulation. The whole system worked on one principle that most frontier builders of the era had never consciously applied. The earth is a thermal reservoir. Below the frost line, the ground maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round. In that region of Montana, somewhere between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 11 degrees Celsius. That baseline temperature requires only a modest addition of heat to become genuinely comfortable for sleeping. Instead of fighting the winter with a roaring fire maintained all night long, Edna's design used the planet itself as a heat bank, drawing on stored geothermal warmth and supplementing it with the slow bleed of the hearth foundation just inches away. During the first winter of use, 1882 to 1883, oral account from Roy Calloway's letters to his brother in Pennsylvania described the chamber as maintaining temperatures between 58 degrees Fahrenheit and 64 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 to 18 degrees Celsius, throughout the night, without any fire burning inside the room itself. And with the main hearth banked to low coals after 10 p.m., Clara did not cough that winter. Not once. Word got around the valley the way it always did in small frontier communities, slowly, sideways, and usually wrong. By the summer of 1882, while Roy and Edna were still finishing the chamber's interior walls, a few neighbors had heard rumors of what was being built beneath the Callaway cabin. Most of them received the news with the kind of mild amusement reserved for things that seem harmless but vaguely eccentric. A bedroom underground. All right, if that's how the Callaways wanted to spend their summer, nobody was going to stop them. A woman named Harriet Folsom, who homesteaded a quarter-mile east along the same ridge, stopped by in July with a jar of preserved plums and a curiosity she couldn't quite hide. Edna showed her the chamber, the framed entrance, the stacked limestone walls, the ventilation channels, the sleeping platforms. Harriet stood at the bottom of the ladder for a long moment, looked around, and said, "It's tidy." Then she climbed back up and didn't mention it again. Two brothers, Caleb and Orrin Marsh, who ran a small timber operation at the north end of the valley, rode past the Callaway place in August and asked Roy what the project was about. Roy explained. Caleb listened with his hat pushed back on his head and a half-smile that said more than any words would have. Orrin said, "That's going to be damp by February." Roy said he didn't think so. Orrin said, "It'll be damp." But the remark that stuck, the one that traveled through the valley and came back to Edna more than once, came from Gus Prentice, the former carpenter who ran the trading post. He had seen the trapdoor during a visit to the cabin in September, just before the first snows. He stood over it with his arms crossed, said nothing for a moment, and then delivered his verdict in the flat, certain tone of a man who had built things his whole life and knew what worked and what didn't. "You didn't build a bedroom, Edna. You built a grave with a ladder." He wasn't being cruel, exactly. He was being practical, the way men with experience often are when they encounter something they haven't seen before and mistake unfamiliarity for error. He had built in cold climates. He knew about moisture migration, about ground seep, about the way cold air pooled in low spaces. His concerns were not unreasonable. He was also completely wrong about what was going to happen next. Edna thanked him for stopping by and offered him coffee. He declined and rode back to the trading post. That winter came early, the first hard frost arriving in the second week of October. And within 2 months, every family on that ridge would have reason to revisit Gus Prentice's confident dismissal. January 14th, 1884. The temperature at dawn was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 30 degrees Celsius. The storm that came down from Canada that week had been building for days over the northern plains. A deep Arctic mass, that meteorological record from the Fort Missoula station, approximately 60 miles to the north, would later describe as the most sustained cold event in at least 17 years. It arrived in the Bitterroot Valley not with the drama of a blizzard, but with a quieter, more dangerous weapon, a dry, relentless wind out of the northwest that drove the effective temperature well below what the thermometer showed, and a cold so consistent and so deep that it didn't let up for 9 consecutive days. By the 3rd day, firewood consumption across the valley had doubled. By the 5th day, several households had burned through their entire winter reserves and were sending riders to neighboring homesteads to beg, borrow, or buy split wood at prices nobody had asked for since the valley was first settled. The Marsh brothers, Caleb and Orrin, the timbermen, ran out of dry wood on the 6th day, a fact that was noted with some irony by those who later heard the full story. The cabins on the ridge suffered most. At that elevation, the wind found every gap, every poorly sealed joint, every spot where the chinking had dried and cracked over the summer. Harriet Folsom, the neighbor who had called Edna's chamber tidy, later told her daughter that during the worst night of the storm, she sat awake by her hearth and watched the fire consume more wood in a single hour than she normally burned in half a day, and still could not keep the far wall of her cabin above freezing. Inside the Callaway cabin, the main hearth burned at a moderate pace. Roy fed it with medium-sized logs at intervals of roughly 3 hours through the night, about 40% less wood, by his own estimate, than their neighbors were consuming to achieve the same or lesser effect. The reason was the thermal strategy Edna had built into the structure. The earth chamber below acted as a heat sink that moderated the temperature of the entire floor level, and the sandstone hearth foundation, by now absorbing and radiating 3 seasons' worth of accumulated fire heat, was doing slow, silent, continuous work that no one standing outside in the storm could have measured or seen. But it was what happened below ground that made the difference no one in that valley would forget. On the night of January 17th, the coldest recorded night of the event, with an outside temperature reported at minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 33 degrees Celsius. Clara Calloway and her younger brother slept in the underground chamber on their pine-framed sleeping platforms, under 2 wool blankets, with both ventilation plugs closed. Roy descended at midnight to check the temperature using a small glass thermometer he had acquired at the trading post the previous autumn. The reading, 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. Outside, minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 33 degrees Celsius. Inside the earth chamber, 61 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees Celsius. A difference of 89 degrees Fahrenheit. With no fire burning in the room. With no additional heat source beyond the passive bleed of the hearth foundation through the adjacent stone wall and the thermal mass of the earth itself. He climbed back up the ladder, sat down by the hearth, and stared at the fire for a long time. Stay with me, because when the valley woke up on January 19th and the storm finally broke, what people found when they compared notes didn't just surprise them. It changed how they built for the next 2 generations. The number that came out of that hole in the ground silenced every skeptic on that ridge, including Gus Prentice. The morning of January 19th, 1884 arrived the way mornings do after a long and brutal ordeal, quietly, almost apologetically. The wind had dropped to nothing. The sky over the Bitterroot Range was pale and clear. The kind of blue that only exists after a cold front has wrung every last particle of moisture from the air. The temperature at sunrise was still minus 11 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 24 degrees Celsius, but the stillness made it feel survivable in a way that the previous 9 days had not. People emerged from their cabins slowly, cautiously, the way animals emerge from cover when they are not yet certain the danger has passed. What they found when they compared notes was not a clean victory for anyone. It was a reckoning. The Marsh brothers, Caleb and Orrin, the timbermen who had told Roy that the underground chamber would be damp by February, had burned through their full winter wood supply by January 16th. They had spent the final 3 days of the storm burning furniture, 2 chairs, a pine shelf unit, and the better part of a workbench. Orrin's hands showed frostbite on 2 fingers. Their cabin's interior temperature had reportedly dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 degree Celsius on the worst night, a single degree above freezing, sustained only by continuous fire that consumed wood faster than a man could reasonably split it. Harriet Folsom had fared better, but not well. She had kept her family alive and reasonably warm, but at a cost. By her own count, she had burned approximately 2.1 cords of wood during those 9 days. Nearly a third of her entire winter reserve consumed in less than 2 weeks. She would need to find more wood before March, and finding dry, split firewood in January in that valley was neither easy nor cheap. Roy Calloway's count told a different story. During those same 9 days, the Calloway household burned 0.9 cords, less than half what Harriet had consumed, and roughly 43% of what the Marsh brothers had burned before running out entirely. The main hearth had been kept at a moderate, steady burn rather than a desperate roar. The cabin's upper level had stayed between 52 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 11 to 14 degrees Celsius, throughout, cool, but livable. In the underground chamber, where Clara and her brother had slept every night of the storm, had not dropped below 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 14 degrees Celsius, at any recorded point. Not once. Roy had taken temperature readings every night at midnight, logging them in the small leather-bound notebook he kept on the mantelpiece. Those numbers, scrawled in pencil, smudged at the edges, perfectly matter-of-fact, would be passed around that valley for the rest of the winter and referenced for years afterward. January 14th. Outside, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Chamber 61 degrees Fahrenheit. January 15th. Outside, minus 19 degrees Fahrenheit. Chamber 60 degrees Fahrenheit. January 17th. Outside, minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Chamber 61 degrees Fahrenheit. January 18th. Outside, minus 24 degrees Fahrenheit. chamber 59 degrees Fahrenheit. The chamber had not swung more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit across the entire event. Not because of a blazing fire, not because of a clever stove, because of stone, earth, geometry, and one woman's refusal to accept that the cold coming up from the ground was simply a fact of life to be endured. Gus Prentice came to the Callaway cabin on January 23rd, 4 days after the storm broke. He came alone, on horseback, without announcement. Roy was outside splitting wood when he rode up. Gus dismounted, tied his horse, and stood for a moment looking at the cabin without speaking. Then he said, "Can I see it?" Roy took him inside, showed him the trapdoor, let him climb down the ladder. Gus stood in the underground chamber for a long time, running his hand along the limestone wall, pressing his palm flat against the sandstone section adjacent to the hearth foundation, testing the floor planks with his boot, crouching to look at the air-gap grid of river stones beneath. He was not smiling. He was not apologizing. He was doing what skilled builders do when they encounter a solution that works and that they did not think of first. He was reverse engineering it, quietly and carefully, filing every detail away. When he climbed back up, he stood in the cabin for another moment and said, "The wall next to the chimney, that was the key, wasn't it?" It wasn't a question. Edna, who had been standing near the hearth with her arms crossed, said, "That and everything else." Gus nodded once, put on his hat, and left. He did not call it a grave again. By the following autumn, the fall of 1884, 3 families along the ridge had begun excavating earth chambers beneath their existing cabins. Not copies of Edna's design exactly, but variations. One family used a different entrance position. Another substituted fieldstone for the limestone wall lining. A third added a small iron brazier inside the chamber for nights when extra heat was needed. The adaptations were practical and local, shaped by available materials and individual needs. By the winter of 1885 to 1886, according to recollections later recorded by a schoolteacher in the valley who made a habit of documenting community history, at least 9 homesteads within a 30-mile radius had incorporated some version of an earth-sheltered sleeping space into their structures. The schoolteacher noted in her journal, "What Mrs. Callaway did beneath her floor has become, quietly and without ceremony, the sensible thing to do." Gus Prentice rebuilt the sleeping quarters of his own home in the spring of 1885. He dug 4 feet down, not as deep as Edna's chamber, but deep enough. He used sandstone on the wall nearest his hearth. He did not mention Edna's name when neighbors asked about the project, but everyone in the valley knew where the idea had come from, what Edna Callaway understood, and what the settlers of that valley learned the hard way, the only way frontier communities ever truly learned anything, was that heat is not just a matter of fire. It is a matter of mass, geometry, and patience. The earth beneath a well-built cabin is not a cold enemy to be sealed out and ignored. It is a thermal reservoir, a slow, stable, ancient battery that has been absorbing and releasing the sun's energy for longer than any human structure has existed. Below the frost line, that temperature is consistent. It doesn't spike, it doesn't drop, it doesn't respond to a single bad night or a 9-day Arctic front. It simply holds. The principles Edna applied in that Montana valley in 1882 are the same principles that Scandinavian builders used in their semi-subterranean longhouses centuries earlier, the same ones that drove the design of the native Alaskan Barabara, an earth-sheltered dwelling that maintained livable temperatures in some of the harshest conditions on the continent, and the same ones that modern earth-sheltered home designers still use today when they want to dramatically reduce heating loads without relying on mechanical systems. She didn't invent the idea. She rediscovered it because her child was coughing and the floor was cold, and she had no patience for problems she couldn't solve. That is how it has always worked in every era and every climate. The most durable innovations in human shelter did not come from academies or pattern books. They came from people with specific problems, limited materials, and the stubbornness to try something that looked wrong until winter proved it right. Edna Callaway was not famous. She is not in any history book, but in one small valley in the Bitterroot Range, on a ridge where the wind still hunts in January, the design she put into the ground outlasted the cabin above it by decades. Neighbors built versions of it. Their children remembered it. And when the cold came back, as it always does, those earth chambers held their temperatures with the same quiet, unhurried certainty that the planet itself has always maintained. The grave with a ladder, as Gus Prentice had called it, turned out to be the warmest room in the valley. That's the story of Edna Calloway and the hidden bedroom that survived the worst storm in 17 years. If this is the kind of history that makes you want to build something, or at least think differently about the ground beneath your feet, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you a real technique from a real place that worked when lives depended on it. No fluff, no modern shortcuts, just the engineering that frontier people figured out the hard way. And before you go, drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And what is the coldest night you have ever personally survived? We read every single one. See you next week. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.